Your parents taught you to be broke and afraid you didn't come into this world afraid. You were trained into it. Fear was handed to you before language, before logic, before you had any say in who you'd become. The world wasn't introduced as something to explore. It was introduced as something to survive. Be careful. Don't touch that. Slow down. Those weren't warnings. They were commands written directly into your nervous system. And over time, fear stopped feeling emotional. It started feeling logical, responsible, mature. That's the danger of early programming. You grow up thinking your limitations are your personality. You weren't taught how to face challenges. You were taught how to avoid them. You weren't taught how to take risks. You were taught that discomfort means danger. And by the time you had the capacity to choose differently, the script was already running. You inherited patterns you never consented to, and you've been negotiating with them ever since. Because while you were learning to walk, climb, reach, explore, the adults around you were unknowingly teaching you the opposite. Sit, wait, behave, be careful, slow down. That's how fear becomes your first language. And whatever speaks to you first usually becomes the authority for life. The universe is speaking. You can take an action now that will program your subconscious mind. Say yes, commit to yourself right now to trigger your subconscious mind, sending a message that you're ready. Prove it by this powerful symbolic action. Click on the subscribe button and like this video. By doing this, you'll win. If you don't click on subscribe, you'll trigger the opposite, and you've opened Pandora's box to more suffering, so don't risk it. Click the subscribe button for success. Safety became the religion you didn't know you joined. Safety is useful when it's a tool. It becomes destructive when it turns into a belief system. What started as reasonable protection slowly became a doctrine. Avoid risk, avoid mistakes, avoid discomfort. The world wasn't something to build in. It was something to hide from. If something made you nervous, you were told it was a sign to stop. If something challenged you, it was framed as irresponsible. No one taught you how to fall and get back up. They taught you not to fall at all. But a life built on safety doesn't produce strength. It produces fragility. When safety becomes sacred, courage becomes a violation. Growth feels reckless. Uncertainty feels immoral. And people raised on safety, first thinking, eventually believe they are doing the right thing while living the smallest version of their lives. You were taught to preserve yourself, not expand yourself. And you can't outgrow a system you were trained to obey without question. Obedience became the first currency. You learned to trade. Before you ever learned how to think, you learned how to behave. Obedience was rewarded, resistance was punished. Maybe not harshly, but subtly. A smile when you complied, a sigh when you didn't. Approval for being agreeable. Distance when you spoke up. Children pick up energy faster than language, and you learned the lesson quickly. Be who they prefer, not who you are. You didn't stop asking questions because you weren't curious. You stopped because questions created tension. You didn't stop expressing yourself because you lacked personality. You stopped because expression disrupted harmony. Obedience became your survival strategy. And here's the twisted part. Eventually, obedience stops feeling imposed and starts feeling moral. You start believing that compliance makes you good. You mistake submission for maturity. You confuse being easy to manage with being easy to love. But obedience kills something crucial: initiative, independence, leadership, the willingness to disrupt. You don't notice the cost until years later when you hesitate to make decisions, hesitate to take risks, hesitate to trust yourself. You wait for permission as an adult because you were rewarded for waiting as a child. You weren't taught how to lead your life. You were taught how to fit inside one. Authority replaced curiosity, and thinking became something you outsourced. You were born curious. All children are. But somewhere along the way, why became uncomfortable for the adults around you. Because I said so. That's just how it is. Don't question authority. Every time an adult shut down your curiosity, a piece of self-trust disappeared with it. You learned that truth came from outside you, not within you. You learned that your voice was secondary, your perception unreliable, your doubt a sign of disrespect. And slowly, you stopped exploring. You started accepting. This creates adults who know instructions but not insight, rules but not reasoning, systems but not self-direction. You end up looking around the room for who's in charge before you act, even when the room is your own life. A person who cannot trust themselves becomes easy to control, not by force, but by habit. Mistakes became shame, instead of training. As a child, mistakes weren't treated as part of learning. They were treated as failures of character. The message wasn't, try again, it was, don't get it wrong. You weren't encouraged to practice. You were encouraged to avoid error. And that's how you learned hesitation. You learned to overthink, to overprepare, to procrastinate, to stay invisible until you were certain you couldn't fail. But certainty is impossible, so you end up waiting forever. Mistakes are how confidence is built. Mistakes are how skill is built. Mistakes are how leadership is built. But if mistakes were associated with embarrassment, judgment, or emotional withdrawal, you learn to protect yourself instead of express yourself. You learn to play small because small felt safer. A person who fears mistakes becomes a person who never grows beyond the boundaries someone else drew for them. Love became conditional, so you became conditional. 2. Love should teach people they can be real. Instead, you learned you had to perform. You got more affection when you behaved right, and emotional distance when you didn't. You learned which version of yourself made relationships easier, smoother, more peaceful. So you adjusted. You shaped yourself. You softened edges, silenced truths, suppressed needs. You stopped being you and started being acceptable. This is how self-betrayal begins, quietly, subtly, disguised as being good. As an adult, you stay in jobs that drain you because leaving feels like conflict. You stay in relationships that break you because leaving feels like guilt. You bite your tongue because honesty feels like danger. Conditional love teaches you that authenticity costs connection, so you sacrifice authenticity to keep connection. And eventually, you wake up a stranger to yourself. School didn't teach you to think. It taught you to wait, raise your hand, ask permission, follow the rules, sit still, do what you're told. School didn't prepare you for life. It prepared you to follow instructions. You learned external evaluation matters more than internal satisfaction. You learned authority defines success. You learned initiative is dangerous unless approved by someone above you. So when adulthood arrived, you didn't know how to self-direct. You waited for clarity, waited for permission, waited for confidence, waited for a guarantee. School turned your instincts off and turned your dependency on, and dependency feels safe until it becomes a cage. Average was marketed as virtue. You were quietly discouraged from standing out. Don't try too hard, don't want too much, don't make others uncomfortable. Excellence was tolerated only if it didn't disrupt the group. Ambition was reframed as arrogance. Intensity was labeled a problem. So you learned to dim yourself. You learned to hide your hunger. You learned to match the room, not lead it. They told you being average was responsible. They told you being ordinary was noble. They told you blending in was maturity. But average is just a polite word for unrealized potential. People don't stay average because they lack talent. They stay average because they were trained to fear what excellence demands: visibility, rejection, risk, pressure, judgment. You were taught to fear the cost of greatness while never tasting the reward of it. Risk was labeled irresponsible. Risk wasn't presented as a tool. It was presented as danger. You heard, be realistic. Don't get ahead of yourself. Stick to what you know. They weren't trying to hold you back, but the effect was the same. You learned to measure decisions by potential downside, not potential upside. You learned to protect what little you had instead of learning how to build more. You learned to fear uncertainty instead of mastering it. People avoid risk not because they can't handle it, but because they were never taught how. Risk is where life expands. Risk is where opportunity hides. Risk is where confidence grows. But if risk was framed as recklessness, then responsibility becomes another word for obedience, and obedience does not create success. It creates workers, followers, people who dream in secret and settle in public. Money was introduced as scarce and stressful. Money wasn't taught as a skill, it was taught as something to fear. Don't talk about money. Don't lose money. Money changes people. Rich people are greedy. You weren't given a financial education. You were given financial anxiety. That anxiety shaped everything. You aimed lower than your potential. You accepted jobs beneath your capability. You stayed where income felt safe. You avoided opportunities that required courage. You made decisions to prevent loss instead of create growth. Scarcity thinking becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Money isn't scarce, but disciplined thinking is, ownership is, courage is, self-belief is. Until you rewrite your beliefs about money, you will unconsciously sabotage the results you say you want. Authority replaced self-trust. At some point, you stopped believing you were qualified to make decisions for your own life. You deferred to bosses, systems, experts, institutions, approval. Your internal voice became the last voice you consulted. That's why you hesitate. That's why you second guess. That's why you wait instead of act. You weren't taught to trust yourself. You were taught to trust whoever stood above you. But adulthood without self-trust is not adulthood. It's supervised living. Fear became your default decision filter. Fear shaped more of your life than logic ever did. You chose safety over alignment, predictability over fulfillment, stability over meaning, comfort over growth. Fear starts small, but it expands until it decides everything. You don't ask, "What do I want?" You ask, "What won't hurt me?" You don't ask, "Who can I become?" You ask, "What's the least risky path?" Fear is not the problem. Obeying fear is. Fear can inform you, but it should never direct you. Broke is a mindset before. It's a condition. You weren't born broke. You were trained to think broke. Broke thinking avoids responsibility, avoids risk, avoids pressure, avoids visibility, avoids leadership. You think you're protecting yourself, but you're protecting your limitations. Wealthy thinking isn't about money. It's about ownership. Ownership of your decisions, your direction, your time, your skills, your future. People stay broke not because they lack opportunity, but because they lack permission from themselves to pursue opportunity. Fear keeps you in bad relationships. People don't stay in painful relationships because they don't know better. They stay because fear tells them it's safer than the unknown. Fear says, "What if you end up alone? What if you can't do better? What if you're the problem? What if starting over is worse?" Fear convinces you that familiar misery is safer than unfamiliar freedom. And you believe it because you were trained to. Fear doesn't care if you're fulfilled. Fear cares if you're stable. So fear will keep you in situations that destroy you slowly, as long as they don't threaten your comfort. Obedience killed leadership instincts. You weren't trained to lead, you were trained to comply. Leadership requires initiative, decisiveness, courage, responsibility, visibility, and you were taught to avoid all five. So when opportunities appear, you hesitate. When responsibility calls, you freeze. When decisions need to be made, you delay. Leadership didn't disappear. It was suppressed. But instinct can return the moment obedience ends. Courage was never modeled. Only caution. Courage isn't natural. It's practiced, but you never practiced it. You practiced avoidance, hesitation, caution. Courage doesn't mean acting without fear. It means acting while fear is still loud. It means moving forward even when your conditioning screams, stop. You were taught to interpret fear as danger. You must now learn to interpret fear as direction. Fear points to exactly where your growth lives. Deprogramming requires disobedience. Insight isn't enough. Understanding isn't enough. Awareness isn't enough. You can fully understand your conditioning and still repeat it tomorrow. Change begins only when you break the obedience cycle. You must disobey. Fear, hesitation, inherited beliefs, scarcity, approval, addiction, programmed caution. You stop negotiating with the past voice inside your head and start authoring your own. Disobedience is not rebellion. It's sovereignty. You don't wait for permission. You choose. You accept consequence. You take ownership. You stop living the life you were trained to survive and start living the life you were meant to build. Freedom isn't the absence of fear. It's the absence of obedience to fear. When you choose yourself, truly choose yourself, your life stops being a repetition of the past and becomes a declaration of the future.